Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the Stream's online pre-show. On today's programme, what will be the new normal for the United States and Cuba? So to discuss this and a lot more, we've got some great guests lined up, but let me first dip into our online community and see how the conversation is working out there.
Great guests here too. There's some interesting conversation. Some people tweeting us from Cuba, it's true, and others outside of it, majority of course. And we want to hear from you wherever you are in the world, so tweet us with hashtag AJStream.
Let me tell you about our guests. From Adelaide, Australia, we have Alfredo De Lara. He is an independent filmmaker and journalist, also Cuban-American. From Miami, we have John Suarez. He's an international secretary for the Cuban American Directorate. And in Providence, Rhode Island, Orlando Luis Pardo Lazo is a Cuban writer and photographer. And we're hoping to get our connection back with Carlos Alberto Perez Benitez. He is in Havana, Cuba, but you can understand that connections are a little tricky. And Carlos is just joining us. Carlos, fantastic to have you. Carlos, if I asked you, what's the difference between a Cuban and a Cuban American? What would you say? Carlos, what would you say? Let me get Carlos back.
Yes, sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
The difference between a Cuban and a Cuban American is what? How would you sum up that difference? Well, Carlos is thinking about that, I'm going to go across to Alfredo. Alfredo, this is something you've been wrestling with your entire life. If you had to sum it up for our international community, they would be that they're all a bunch of Cubans. What's the difference? Your difference would be what?
Well, I mean, essentially, we're all Cuban, in our hearts, but there's definitely some big differences. And within the Cuban community, there's the exiles, but the exile groups are also broken up into four different times when they arrived to the United States and elsewhere. So there's Cubans that have pretty much spent their entire lives in Cuba. Very few Cubans have actually traveled outside of outside of Cuba.
Yeah.
And then you have this about 2.5 million Cubans that live outside of Cuba that have left for different reasons.
Right. Okay, so let me just ask Orlando. So, Orlando would probably classify himself as Cuban. Orlando, what makes you different from, say, Alfredo?
I appreciate the difference between Cuban literature and Cuban American literature. I consider Cuban American author those who think in English. We have a different idea, something that was left behind and needs to be recovered in a way. But when you have Cuba in your soul, even if you came to America being a child, and I know many cases, I consider them Cubans, and I think that in the future we will be once again only one people.
Oh, I love that. As a little tantalizing teaser for our conversation we're about to have as we go online and live on TV and on the internet. Stay with us. We're talking to Cubans and Cuban-Americans on today's stream. Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, the United States and Cuba are getting reacquainted after more than 50 years. What does the recent deal to normalize relations mean for Cubans and Cuban-Americans? So you can't really talk Cuba without talking politics, but we are taking politicians out of the mix and talking to real people today. Felica Bilal, you have plenty going on online.
Exactly. One way to see what real people think is to check Instagram. So this is where we went to see the reaction from people after the announcement of normalized relations. This is a reaction from Cuban Americans. This is Aliette Christian. She writes, "To a free Cuba," and several hashtags there, including "Thank you, Obama." And on the other side of the spectrum, we have this tweet from Stina Bay. today, who shows two protesters who are pretty unhappy about the announcement. And we want to know your view, whichever side of the aisle you fall on. Just tweet us your take with #AJStream.
So we're discussing Cuba today, but we'll always keep an eye on stories making news in your part of the world. Have a look here at Facebook. Don't forget to like us on Facebook. Check us out there. Check out the stories we're covering. You'll find a space to put in your ideas, your suggestions, your comments, and you too could be in the stream.
Hi, I'm Oscar Guardiola. I'm a Latin American writer and I am in the stream.
In December, Presidents Barack Obama and Raul Castro announced the start of normalizing relations between the two countries and re-establishing ties.
But I believe that we can do more to support the Cuban people and promote our values through engagement. After all, these 50 years have shown that isolation has not worked. It's time for a new approach.
Today, North American citizen Alan Gross was also returned to his country.
Ciudadano norteamericano Alan Gross.
We have agreed to re-establish diplomatic relations.
As well as the release of political prisoners, the deal also calls for lifting travel restrictions and easing the economic embargo. US Secretary of State John Kerry will also re-examine the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. So as the relationship between the US and Cuba enters the next chapter, what will the impact of this deal be? Joining me to discuss this and a lot more, Alfredo De Laro is a filmmaker and journalist. He's also Cuban American. In Miami, we have John Suarez. He's a Cuban American human rights activist and the International Secretary for the Cuban Democratic Directorate, a Cuban American NGO. On the phone, we have Carlos Alberto Perez. He is a Cuban journalist and the Director of Technology for the Revisto Tino publication. And Orlando Luis Pardo Lazo is a Cuban writer and photographer. He's currently on a fellowship at Brown University in Rhode Island. So, gentlemen, welcome. It's great to have you here in the stream. John, if I asked you if you could put your finger on what is different today following this December announcement for Cuban Americans, what's different? What's changed?
Well, the biggest change, unfortunately, is that Gerardo Hernandez, who was serving a double life sentence, one of them for the murder of four individuals, three of them American citizens, one an American resident, has been returned to Cuba. And we are concerned that what has taken place is that the hardliners in the regime have been rewarded with this deal. They were able to take Alan Gross hostage. They held him for 25 days before an American diplomat was able to see him. The American government kept a very low profile during his detention, and we believe that sent a message to the Castro regime that they could hang on to him as a negotiating piece, which they did successfully over 5 years, and trade him for three spies that had been involved in planning terrorist acts on U.S. soil, and in fact were involved in a conspiracy that led to the murder of four individuals, 3 U.S. citizens and 1 American resident. So a lot of people, including people that would like to see the embargo lifted, are very concerned by this turn of events with the Obama administration.
All right, so here I hear John talking about a sequence of events. I'm not hearing really what Cubans may see as being different. Now, Orlando, you are Cuban, you're in the US right now, but when your family heard about this announcement, how's life changed for them, if at all?
Yes, definitely there was an impact in Cuba, in Cubans, and especially on the island. For the first time in many days, the super enemy, the justification of all failures of Cuban government, so it seems to be not so much the enemy or not so much the cause, the real cause of all the failures seem to be then maybe our Cuban government, and then the level of criticism, the level of requesting and making accountable our government should be now stronger, or at least the civil society should be striving stronger in order to claim democratic values in my country. Now that the equation has been de-Americanized, there is no conflict with America, then the conflict is as it always was between the Cuban government, a despotic regime, and the Cuban people, devoid of all rights.
Well, you mentioned rights there. So, Alfredo, actually, I want to direct these next two tweets from you to you, and they reference what was being said. Now, this is in asking what's changed and what hasn't. This gives us a view. Harold writes in, I was in Cuba. A friend called me, and I couldn't believe it. And he's talking about the time of the announcement. I remember the internet almost collapsed that day on the island. But on the other hand, Alfredo, this tweeter, Henry, writes in, what won't change are human rights. Castro repression, as this person says, is on the rise. Alfredo, what do you think of that?
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely two, main camps in all of this, and really, in legal terms, nothing has changed in Cuba at all. This is an initiative that both countries have agreed to move ahead on, but no laws have changed. No status of anything at all from a legal standpoint has changed at all. It's just that both countries have agreed to explore renewing diplomatic relations. So what's changed is hope on one side in Cuba. A lot of people have hope, and in the United States, among certain sector of the exile community, there's fear that they've lost this epic battle, that has defined their whole existence essentially. And in Cuba, they're celebrating in the government as a victory. They're celebrating this as a victory, but in reality, when we look at it, completely objectively, nothing's changed at all as we stand right now. Now,
except for the spies that have been released.
Oh, well, but I mean, this is something that doesn't really affect the outcome of what's happening in Cuba or the United States. It's great that for those families of those spies that were released.
That's where I beg to differ.
Mm-hmm. Okay, go ahead. How is the releasing of those spies?
I think that the propaganda campaign that the regime has had going on since 1998 of releasing these 5 spies that were engaged in planning acts of state terrorism, and it was, for all effects, a swap with Alan Gross, essentially a hostage exchange. It was. I mean, they were pushing it and saying Alan Gross will be returned when these 5 spies are returned. Now they're saying that there was an additional agent thrown into the mix and that the release of Alan Gross was a humanitarian gesture. I don't buy that. The bottom line is the 5 agents are in Cuba. Alan Gross got to finally leave.
So, John,
that was a policy put forward by the hardliners.
Gentlemen, John, you sound really upset. Because why? Help us out as an international community. Why are you so furious?
It's serious because the idea of taking a U.S. citizen hostage, in the case of Alan Gross, and using him through essentially blackmailing the U.S. government to release 5 people that had engaged in acts that led to the deaths of U.S. citizens.
Is there a bigger picture here, John?
Wait a minute. Let me finish.
Yeah, go ahead.
You're establishing a relationship there where the hardline elements in the regime are the ones that are being rewarded. Now, when they're going and having their internal discussions, those who say, we shouldn't be taking people hostage or we shouldn't be sending agents over planning terrorist attacks will have to shut up because, hey, taking an American hostage, holding him for 5 years paid off.
I get it. I get you've made this point beautifully. John, take a pause for a moment because I actually want to go to Havana. I'm really curious to see what Carlos has to say about this. Carlos, do you feel that the administration in Cuba is being rewarded for the way they're running Cuba right now because of this announcement?
Well, I think it's been a fair decision, not only for the Cuban government, but for both countries. I think that this distance during almost more than half a century, it was not right. It's not about right now politics or economics. We are talking about peoples, the U.S. people and the Cuban people. So we, the people, not the government, is the ones who are paying the government decisions. So I think it was a right decision, and I think the Cuban government was not rewarded with that decision.
So, Carlos, how would you persuade John that it was the right decision? Because John is a Cuban American, you're Cuban, John is really upset about this, but you live in Cuba. How do you persuade him that this is a good idea?
Well, I think that many Cubans that live in the USA will never agree with many Cubans that live here in the island. So I would have a lot of concerns about that, so I don't. So what I think is that both countries deserve to be closer than separated. So if anybody in Miami or in the US is upset, so I'm sorry. I'm very happy here in Cuba, and I would like to have many Americans on my streets and then and to talk about our cultures and to talk about baseball and to talk about everything. So we welcome that decision of both presidents.
You know, Alfredo, Carlos was talking about the gap, really, that Cuban Americans may not always agree with those who are actually in Cuba. And so I wanted to delve into that a little bit more with this tweet from Greg. He writes in, my thought is, I want to see my father's home, but I want to see it in the context of freedom, both mine and the Cuban people's. And he goes on to say, I want my children to see their grandfather's birthplace. I want them to see it freely and openly. And it seems to me, at least, that there's a sense of longing there. There's a sense of nostalgia. Are those things that you can relate to?
Yeah, I mean, sure. You know, I'm Cuban American too. I wasn't born in Cuba. I was born in the United States. And the first time I went there, I was 24 years old as a journalist. And of course, I had to take that trip to go see my parents' house and my mom's school and so on. But what happens is that when you grow up Cuban American, you grow up with this in the United States. You grow up with this nostalgia that you inherit from your parents and your grandparents. So your whole view on Cuba is painted in black and white photographs, in stories. I mean, in my family, they always talked about Cuba as I thought it was like a dead relative. It was always in the past tense. And I didn't even realize till I was in my 20s that Cuba was still a country today. You know, I was like 10, 11-year-old kid. I used to watch the sci-fi movies and stuff, and I thought maybe Cuba was like Atlantis, that it had, sunk into the ocean or something. And I think that for a lot of Cubans that live in exile and sort of that, especially that older generation that came in the 1960s, because there were 4 marked migration groups from Cuba. But I'm talking specifically right now about that 60s group. They sort of live in that time still. Cuba froze, like those old cars that you see on the street. That's how their mentalities are. It's a time warp when you talk to them. And if I sort of let me know if I'm taking too much time, because everything is so complicated.
I do want to bring in John. So take a breath.
Okay.
Because you gave me that reason to do that. John, let me just bring you in.
Actually,
you did go to Cuba as a youngster. What's that memory that you have?
Not only that, my experience is also a little different than what he's talking about. My parents left during the Batista regime. They returned in 1959. They saw what was taking place, so they returned back to the United States because they didn't want to undergo the experience of a new dictatorship. But they'd already been exiled during the Batista years. They returned again in 79 when I was a child. And they went again in the 90s and up to 2000 when my father and mother were denied visas and were not allowed to return to Cuba by the Cuban government. So for us, it wasn't this nostalgia trip. I have family in Cuba. I have relatives. I know the reality of what's taking place. But the killings and the repression is not something that happened 50 years ago. Osvaldo Payar Sardinas, Harold Cepeda were murdered on July 22nd of 2012. When the United States began its secret negotiations 18 months before December 17th, opposition activists were being attacked with machetes in the streets of Cuba. So this isn't a nostalgia trip. It's not something about the past. It is current injustice is taking place now.
Alfredo?
But look, when I say that we're talking about engaging with the Cuban people, nobody's going to accuse me of being an apologist for the Cuban government. Look, I don't think there's any good guys in this. The United States also has been caught red-handed doing all kinds of dirty tricks, and including assassination attempts and spreading germs and doing biological warfare on the agriculture in Cuba. I mean, there's a whole list of things that both countries
those are accusations
have done.
Made. Whoa. That I have.
Just like
I've heard dirty tricks, biological and germ warfare in Cuba. That's propaganda I've heard from the Castro regime.
Gentlemen, let me just move things.
Look, there's a lot of propaganda on both sides. There's a lot of propaganda on both sides. This is part of the problem.
Sift through it.
This is part of the
problem. The thing is to sift through the propaganda and get to the truth, sir. But what you just said about germ warfare,
I don't think that this is.
Let me just break up the two Cuban Americans, bring in the community, and actually bring in a Cuban. That would be novel. All right, Malika, you go first.
Right. Well, Orlando, I'm going to direct this to you because I'd like your thoughts on it. This is a video comment we got from a Cuban American. Now, of course, you are a Cuban in America, so I want your thoughts on what he says. Have a listen.
Nothing in this deal is good for the Cuban exile community, much less the Cuban people on the island. The Castro regime that has been repressing its people for over half a century got everything they wanted out of this deal in exchange for absolutely nothing. No concessions were made by the regime in order to get pretty much everything that they've been wanting to get for the past 50 years.
So Orlando, he says nothing is good in this deal. Do you agree?
In the time of speech of President Obama and General Raúl Castro, you could see a difference in manners. President Obama at least has some rationale, some idea to improve the engagement and also to help to support civil society in Cuba. But General Raúl Castro was speaking in a very stern and warning and saying no concession. He said that, and with his military uniform, and saying this is only the beginning, and we will be claiming for more and more than U.S. owes to the Cuban people. So, society, Raúl Castro, since it's not dialogue, only
okay, Orlando, we're losing you a little bit. We'll come back to you, and hopefully we'll have better audio there. In terms of timing, Carlos, what do you make of this timing? Why now should this relationship between Cuba and the United States thaw? What's your theory? Sometimes it's a little complicated having communications there with Havana. We'll come back, but timing, Alfredo? Do you have a theory as to why now?
Yeah, I think it's really important for the United States. Now, this is not the first time the U.S. has attempted to renew negotiations with Cuba by starting diplomatic relations. This has gone on several times, and I must say also during Republican administration. So it's not just a single party thing. So there's always been something that stopped it in the way. What's happening right now is we haven't seen Fidel Castro. In fact, today exactly is 1 year since we've seen Fidel Castro in public. There's a lot of fears in Washington privately that one of the most dangerous things that can happen right now is Raúl slipping and dying, in the bathtub. There's no clear chain of command. There's no monolithic control. After Raúl leaves power, and then he's already announced he's going to leave power in 2018, remains to be seen, of course. But there's never going to be again somebody that's going to hold these three key positions, which are the chief of the military, the chief of the party, and also the chief of their parliamentary system. So this is their chance. If they're going to negotiate a change, if they're going to negotiate a change, right now is the time to do it. While that monolithic group is still in power, right, and they can give it the okay. It's going to be much more complicated if Raúl or Fidel are not around.
Okay, Malika.
You asked about timing. There is something here that I've seen a lot, and this is one person mentioning it. Dan says the president, and I do believe he means Obama, wanted a big addition to his political legacy before leaving office. It's welcomed and it's intriguing, but of course, when we talk about legacy, John, it's not just on one side. It's not just President Obama. What do you think of timing?
I think the timing is basically political. Obama got reelected. There were the midterm elections. This was the logical time, if you look at it from a purely politically opportunistic lens, where the minimum damage would be done electorally to the Democratic Party for taking this step. And what Alfredo was saying is true. Other administrations have made these diplomatic outreaches, including Republicans, but the administrations who took it farthest, Jimmy Carter in 1977, who opened up the interest section, who lifted the travel ban to Cuba, which is why my family was traveling to Cuba at that time, went much farther. It was only that he was not reelected to a second term that normalization of relations didn't take place there. Bill Clinton, 1992, he opened up the trade in pharmaceuticals, export trade to Cuba. The Brothers to the Rescue shoot-down was in 1996, which instead of taking, in an election year, he had three options: do nothing, engage in a military response to this international crime.
Yeah,
or
John, bring us up to date. I appreciate the
sanctions.
framing, but the time is not our frame. Bring us up to date. So your final theory on timing is what?
No, my final theory is that what you're seeing is a payoff to agricultural business interests that have made about $5 billion in the last 15 years from the Castro regime. And they want to have more business with Cuba, subsidized by U.S. taxpayers, and this is a payoff to them from the Obama administration.
All right. Carlos, welcome back. It's great to have you back in this conversation. In terms of how this conversation is being had in Cuba, are you able to have it? What do people care about most?
Well, people here care in the first place of normalization. I mean, in the first place, the rising of the embargo. That's our first step. We are going to have now embassies in both countries. Our presidents are talking, but meanwhile we still don't rise or lift up the embargo. We are not doing anything because there are a lot of laws in the U.S. that doesn't allow us to move very much forward that we are doing right now.
Okay.
So we can hear, yes?
Yeah, thank you. It's good to hear that perspective from you sitting there in Havana. I want to show you something back here. This was a poll that was done with Americans and Cuban-Americans last year, and it was looking at people in favor of the embargo. 48% was the end of that survey. 52% were in favor of the embargo going. So more in this survey, this poll, were happy about an embargo actually disappearing. And if you look from the ages, starting at the youngest to the oldest, you see how enthusiastic people are as they become younger about the embargo going. So there's definitely a tail here into your 30s and 40s, about 50-50 split. And then as you get older and older, less enthusiastic for the end of the embargo. Telling a little story here about the generations. What stories are you seeing online, Malika?
Well, there's one answer to your question earlier on what could possibly change and what people are caring about the most, because we got this tweet from Jimmy. He's a Cuban American.
Sure.
And he says, my dad was born in Cuba. I met my wife there. I've been there almost 20 times. And what he cares about is the wet foot, dry foot will expire. And that's, of course, the policy that if Cubans reach American soil, their immigration status can be expedited. So that's one of the things that we can touch on in the post show.
Absolutely. I want to show you something very quickly. When I grow up, I want to be Cuban. A Facebook page set up by Alfredo. When you heard about this announcement, Alfredo, I have 30 seconds in my ear. I know you can do this. Help me out here. Why is this Facebook page important?
Well, what I'm trying to do here, I'm trying to touch on my roots as a Cuban American, but also my upbringing as a journalist. And it started off with my family. I would have discussions around the dinner table, and there was so much misinformation, so much propaganda on both sides of the thing. We're going into an electoral year in the United States, so it's like
Facebook page was set up there to help address the misinformation. When I grow up, I want to be Cuban. Alfredo Delaro, that's the shortest he's ever spoken. It's okay, Alfredo. We will take you to the post show. I know there's so much more to talk about between Cubans and Cuban-Americans. One show is not enough. The post show may just do it. Stream.aljazeera.com. On our next show, we're going to be talking about the deadly shooting at the Charlie Hebdo magazine offices. How will it impact France? That's the next AJ Stream. Thanks for watching. Hello again. I know it's a challenge having Cubans and Cuban-Americans in a conversation because one show is not big enough for them, but we have extra time at stream.aljazeera.com. Thank you for joining in the post show. Orlando, communications is a major issue in Cuba. Getting onto the internet, talking outside of Cuba is challenging. We're having Carlos sometimes in the conversation, sometimes not. It's great that we've actually managed to get you on Skype. Do you think this opening up of relations, thawing of relations between the US and Cuba will help Cubans be better connected, perhaps?
I hope so. But since 2011, 4 years ago now, Cuba is connected to the internet through its optical fiber cables from Venezuela, and yet today, when we are talking in this show, the Cuban government is giving zero access to the internet to the Cuban people. We don't have internet in our mobile. So I don't know which is the technical justification. Now President Obama is kindly extending a hand to allow licenses for telecommunication with Cuba, but the Cuban government we are now in 2014, and they do not have any other real reason to prevent internet from the citizen than control the information. They need to control and filter the information, and they are not ready yet to an open society, to a modern 2.0 democratic society. That's my opinion.
Sure. Orlando, what's it like? John, just give me a second. I'm going to go straight to you. Orlando, what's it like living somewhere where you don't have internet and you don't communicate like the rest of the world? How do you talk to each other?
There is what we call webless internet. We circulate information from PDF thanks to the solidarity of many NGOs in Europe, thanks to the solidarity of the Cuban exiles. They have been sending computers, sending pen drives, and then sometimes with the downloaded blogs and the downloaded web pages, we circulate them. We circulate the video from hand to hand, the audios from hand to hand.
Wow.
So it's a technological situation, but at the same time, there is a lot of solidarity and a lot of there is an urge of getting knowledge and trying to be informed, completely independent from the official channel. We only have one television in Cuba. We only have one official press in Cuba, and of course, only one political party in Cuba. All the rest are illegal and unfortunately repressed.
John?
No, I just wanted to add to what Orlando was saying. One of the first things that President Obama did when he came in lifting a number of restrictions was back in 2009 to lift 2010 to lift restrictions on telecommunications, to encourage telecommunications company and the Cuban government or the Castro regime to build the cable instead of from Caracas, which is much farther, to build it from Key West to Cuba. But the Castro regime was not interested in that. They preferred to have the cable from Caracas to Havana, which now the cable is connected to Jamaica, and the part that goes through Jamaica works just fine. So it's interesting that it hasn't reached the Cuban people, but it has reached the Jamaican people, that very same cable.
Milika?
A lot of people are talking about what will change for Americans, and many of them say, well, now we'll be able to travel back and forth, and so that's one of the good things they point out. But Greg here says, great, but before Americans get rich, I'd like Cubans to have enough to eat and for them to have basic freedom. So, Alfredo, to you, my question would be, do you think that the economic reality, do you think that Cubans having enough to eat and to have that kind of freedom, will that change with this loosening of the embargo?
Well, I mean, there's a fear in Cuba, I think, when we analyze this and we look at the possibility of large, multinational corporations moving into Cuba. Will they smother the nascent, entrepreneurial spirit in Cuba? Will they smother it in a capitalist embrace? And it's something that I think that Cuba has to be very careful with as they move forward. They don't want to. Fortunately, I think this is all going to go very slowly. I think the people are very optimistic that by the end of this year, 2015, there's going to be massive changes in Cuba, and that there's going to be, McDonald's and Starbucks on the Malecón. That's not going to happen. And we only have to look at the case of relations with China and see how that took 16 years, before we had most favored nation status with China. Even after, we're talking something that Nixon did, opened up relations with China. And we're still dealing with that in many ways, negotiating with China and tit for tat and shoot downs of planes and this kind of stuff happens occasionally still with China. So if we look at that as an example, we could potentially be back here on the show in 15 years talking about many of these same issues.
Yeah. Do you know, that's probably the most honest thing that anyone's ever said in the whole sort of 40 minutes or so. John?
No, I just want to bring up 2 points. Yeah. One, Alfredo was talking about the threat of capitalism. What we've seen over the last 30 years has been when the regime has fallen into economic crisis, they've had to allow the nascent capitalism of the Cubans to emerge. Farmers markets in the 1980s, privatization of the dollar in the 90s. But the moment that the Europeans in the 90s came in and invested, the first thing the regime did was crush the nascent capitalists and embrace and join partnerships, the outside capitalists. And that's what they'll do here again. When they have hard currency from abroad, they use that opportunity to clamp down on the growing private sector internally that they fear more than the foreign capitals. That's been the track record until now. And also what Alfredo said with regards to China is right on.
John,
we're talking about the shameful history about the United States.
John?
No, but he talked a bit about China and its shameful history of the United States ignoring human rights violations. When the Tiananmen Square massacre happened, high-ranking Republican officials embracing the Chinese in private meetings while the blood was still on the streets with students. And we fear that being repeated in Cuba as well.
All right. See, I'm looking at all of our guests, and our guests are in a certain age group, and I hear the passion that comes from this particular age group. If we go much younger, say, Alfredo, your kids, do they care?
Not really. I was just having a discussion tonight with my daughter. I brought them over to Australia because, frankly, for personal reasons, I find that the United States economic outlook isn't very good, 20 years from now. So there's different things that I've talked to her about Cuba, because we're in a socialist country here in Australia. I mean, it's a democratic socialism. I'm not going to try to compare it with Cuba at all. But there is this sort of safety net and these sort of social values.
Yeah. Back to your kids. Do they care? Keep me on track here.
No.
How do you know they don't care?
Well, you know what I mean. She speaks perfect Spanish, but she doesn't really read any Spanish literature. She doesn't listen to Cuban music. There's no real interest in the culture, and even less in the politics.
Let's see about youngsters in Miami, and then we're checking with Cuba as well. John, young people.
No, I would ask you to invite someone like Rosa Maria Payá, who's young enough to be my daughter, who cares passionately about Cuba and who's written a wonderful op-ed in the Washington Post directed to the president about embracing the democratic desires of the Cuban people and calling for a plebiscite based on the Varela Project that her father pioneered in the 2000s.
I knew that you would know active young young Cuban Americans. Of course you would, John. That is what you do. Let me just go across though to Carlos. Carlos, hopefully you can hear us, because I'm really interested in, is there a feeling amongst young people in Cubans where they're sort of beyond the bitterness and beyond this sort of historical framework that we're having this conversation in? Do they actually care about the relationship between Cuba and the States? Let's say 20-year-olds. Yeah. That connection, it gets me every time. Malika, what's happening online?
I'll end with this tweet because this is someone whose bio says he's tweeting from Cuba. This is Harold. Both governments need to find common ground because it's the Cuban people that are suffering the embargo. And he says this is good news.
Yeah. Orlando, it must be really strange for you sitting here in American as a Cuban, the very first time that you've been in the States, hearing this conversation. What is it like for you?
I have to say that I feel a little sad of having this conversation like this, because in Cuba, both Carlos and Harold Cardenas and LYNNE Diaz and many other bloggers that have access to the internet because they work in official work institutions for the government, and wouldn't never ever accept to have me as a part of the dialogue. I was excluded for several cultural institutions in Cuba, and then we have had to come to the exile or to allow Al Jazeera to propitiate this dialogue. There is the level of tolerance, official tolerance, and unfortunately there is a lot to do about this. And only one point to finish.
Sure.
I would say that when Carlos mentioned that the people to people they are happy, I would like to see if why not President Raúl Castro and as well as President Barack Obama invite the prominent leaders of civil society in Cuba and also the leaders of the exile, which are some of them are very young, and in order to create a civil dialogue and so that the will of the people is not excluded, because what we have seen now, I am finishing here, is a 2-year secret agenda between power, including the Vatican. but the agenda of the people, the will of the people has not been consulted. Maybe my people do not want to approach the United States, I don't know. That would have been to be asked in the public media in Cuba, and we are not discussing that in Cuba, unfortunately. We are discussing this in Al Jazeera.
But we were glad to be the host of this conversation. It's not an easy conversation. There was some tension in this conversation, but I appreciate your time. Orlando and Carlos and John and Alfredo, the conversation will go on. I'm not sure I'll be here in 15 years' time. Alfredo, I have no idea where you will be, Orlando, John or Carlos. I hope you'll all be very happy. And maybe
Likewise.
This conversation is way behind us. And people are like, what are you even talking about relations between Cuba and America? That's so old hat. That's so 2014. I wish you the very best of luck as you continue on this very long journey. Thanks so much for being part of the stream today.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. So, moving on the next show, how will the deadly shooting at the Charlie Hebdo magazine offices, how will that impact France? We'll look at how the country is reacting to its biggest attack in decades. That conversation on the next AJ stream. See you soon.